Oh, we're right about here now.
Now, how can you create musical dynamics with equalization? Well, just as with volume faders, there's a large and complex world of EQ relationships between instruments in the mix. There are two main types of considerations that professional recording engineers use when equalizing sounds for a mix. The first is based on how the sound sounds by itself, in solo, the primary consideration when first EQing the sound at the beginning of the recording session. This consideration is usually based on whether you are going for a sound that is natural or interesting. The second consideration is how the sound sounds in the mix relative to the other instruments, and is of the utmost importance of the two. It used to be that engineers would go out into the room where the instrument is and listen. Then they would go back into the control room and compare the sound in the speakers to what they heard out in the room. However, these days, natural is defined by what is currently on CDs and the radio. You see, natural ain't natural no more. We have become addicted to crisper, brighter, cleaner, as well as fatter, fuller, and bigger. Therefore, to make sounds sound natural can be boring and unnaturally dull by today's standards. What we hear on the radio and on CDs these days are much brighter and crisper than the real thing. Now, what we consider to be natural is an average of what we hear on the market daily. If it isn't bright enough, it won't be considered to be right. On the other hand, these days, often the goal is to come up with a sound that sounds unique or interesting, not necessarily one that sounds natural. I mean, who knows what a natural piece of sheet metal sounds like anyway? The question is, what makes a sound sound interesting or unique? One thing that makes a sound interesting is the complexity of the sound. The more complex the sound, the more it can stand repeated listening. The more you listen to it, the more you hear.
Oh, we're moving right along. We're right about here now.
Structuring the relationship between the tonalities present in each of the instruments is an important aspect that a recording engineer deals with in mixing. As with balancing volume relationships, it's commonly thought that it is most desirable to have the EQ of all of the instruments as even as possible so that they blend well. Well, sometimes this is the case. However, it is often desirable for certain instruments in a mix to be unusually bright, dark, or mid-rangey. Commonly, sounds are mixed so they do work well with each other. Sounds can be made to sound more similar to each other or more dissimilar. A lead instrument might be made to be more cutting and abrasive so as to really grab attention. An instrument might be given extra bass to make the song more danceable or just to excite the rap listener. As previously covered in the second video on equipment, in order to simplify things, we can compare the relative EQ of each sound at each frequency range. We can create various EQ relationships at each frequency range, highs, mid-range, and lows. Although there are a wide range of possibilities for creating EQ dynamics, there's only so much you can do to be creative with EQ. Commonly, the goal, especially for the beginning engineer, is not to be creative with EQ, but to get things just to sound normal, to sound right. Most people are glad if they can just get a mix to sound right. In fact, the boundaries of how creative you can be with EQ before it sounds weird is quite limited. If you go beyond these limits, you're normally no longer being creative. You just have a bad mix. The trick is to learn the limits so that you can be creative within the limits of sanity. The goal is to get to the point where you know the limits of creativity so well that you can EQ something a little off-center. You can make something sound a little strange as an effect. This is when you're truly being creative with EQ. It's funny. The problem comes when you create EQ that is a bit off-center from being exactly natural as an effect, and someone in the band complains that the instrument doesn't sound right. Not only should any unusual EQ be appropriate for the style of music in the song, but you can only do it if the band will let you, or if you can convince them how it works and how cool it is.
We're right about here now.
Because we are so limited as to how creative we can be with EQ, to make EQ changes in a sound while it is playing creates a dynamic that is extremely noticeable. If not appropriate for the song, this could be quite distracting. A good example of where this has been done well is in Aqualung by Jethro Tull, where the voice goes to a telephone-like voice. Pink Floyd also did it in Wish You Were Here, where the acoustic guitar goes into a little box type of sound. Currently, it is considered to be very unusual to actually change EQ settings during a mix. However, it just might be the next creative frontier, especially for those mixing hip-hop and the like.